I'm back with another live Substack video. This is probably going to be our last post and video of the year. That's my plan, unless something crazy happens in the next couple of weeks, like SBA just ends the 8A program. So hopefully this will be the last video of the year. It's been a big year for GovCon Intelligence. We're going to end the year with 1,600 subscribers. We started just on July 9th of this year, and this is the 38th post in the 6 months that we've been in operation. So I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody that subscribes for reading, for watching, following, commenting, etc. Thank you so much for your comments, your questions, and your feedback. It really means a lot to me. So as I look forward to 2026, I'm committed to continuing to bring all of you expert analysis, unique insights, and especially the data and the context that you need. There's just so much happening in government contracting. It's hard to keep up. This newsletter helps you to do that. So with that, I'll go on to updates, questions, and cases. And we actually have a few people joining us live, so feel free to put any questions that you have into the chat. All right. First, I want to go over the article that I posted earlier this week about the amount of confirmed fraud in the 8A program. The article was stating that the amount of confirmed fraud is barely enough to buy a Toyota Corolla. The point of the article was to respond to, in part, and analyze the Senate hearing that took place the week before about fraud in SBA's programs, and to give some context behind the big 8A audit that everybody's that's in the 8A program is going through. Additionally, at the same time, there were letters that went to 22 federal agencies giving examples of what the Senate chair called fraud or abuse of SBA's programs. In looking through some of those examples, it looked like they were primarily about NAICS code compliance. A few of them were about the limitations on subcontracting. In my view, complying with the NAICS code rules is, first of all, complicated. It has some exceptions, but not complying with it, to me, would not be fraud. That's really an SBA responsibility rather than the company being responsible. And then on the limitation on subcontracting, I've said it several times in articles, but I'll say it again. There are exceptions to the limitation on subcontracting. That is a very nuanced rule. There is the similarly situated exception for similarly situated entities. There's also consideration for mixed contracts. So if you have a contract that combines both supplies and services, you don't have to comply with the limitations on subcontract for both of those. You comply with one or the other, and the one that you're not required to comply to can do what you want. There's not a LOS that applies to that. So that's another nuance for the limitations on subcontracting. And additionally, I'll get to in the questions, companies that are in a mentor-protege arrangement have a different calculation for limitations on subcontracting. The big update from this week was that SBA sent out an FAQ, or at least published an FAQ, and then sent out a notice to all of the companies that got the 8A audit letter, stating, first of all, that the deadline for the audit has been extended by 2 weeks, and then clarifying some points that are in the original audit letter. You can find the FAQ at the SBA Atlassian website, and I'll put a link in the notes here. Let's see, I've got it right here. And so I think the big questions that they answered, in addition to extending the due date to January 19th, is, first of all, what are the fiscal years that you're looking at? That was a big question that came out. Is it the government fiscal year? Is it the company's fiscal year? So the FAQ says it's the participant's fiscal year that you're responding to. You should read the question to get the specific years they're referring to, but it's not the government fiscal year, it's the individual's fiscal year. And then I'd put in my article that SBA seemed to have created a term out of thin air in the letter. Number 13 in the audit letter asked companies for their sub-ledger schedule, which I Googled, and all I could find was references back to the SBA letter. So it seemed like SBA seemed to have made up that term. Now, I think what they were referring to in all honesty, is the subledger. So that's fine. Subledger, and SVA responded to the question about the subledger schedule. And it says if there's no subledger, you don't need to provide it. You just provide a brief explanation about why it doesn't exist and attest to its absence. There's also a question in there about businesses that don't have a history of revenue. I imagine that's going to be entity-owned businesses because 8A firms have to have potential for success. And so for most firms, that means they've been in business for 2 years when they get in the program. But for businesses without a history of revenue, they should submit a statement attesting to this for each prompt and then complete the attest and submit steps. I suppose also that could be companies that are coming into the program later within those 3 years, and the question refers to a purchase of an individual 8A within the middle of the term. There's also in there some directions about my SBA certifications. Remember, the certify system is going to end up being not the system, not operational for annual reviews and these sort of submissions. Instead, it goes to my SBA certifications. The FAQ directs users to create an account, claim the business. You have to do that in order to respond to this data call. All right, so much going on with the 8A audit, but I do want to touch on the FAR overhaul. That was the big news, at least the big news up until the 8A audit, but it was the big news for 2025. The FAR overhaul drafters issued the PDF version of the FAR overhaul this week. So that's online now. It's about 1,600 pages. So all in all, what do we get with the FAR overhaul? We went from 2,000 pages to 1,600 pages. The notion of maybe a 100-page FAR, that's well in the past now. You got about a 20% decrease. I talked about this at an event earlier this week, and people guessed the decrease was maybe more like 5 or 10%. So actually 20% is a good drop in what went into the FAR. Now, I will say some of that shifted over to the companion guide and some of these supplementary materials. So altogether, the FAR materials might add up to more than 1,600 pages, but still a 20% drop. The acquisition.gov operators also sent out an email about a new FAR online course about the revolutionary FAR overhaul and an email about their idea scale site to receive feedback on the FAR overhaul. Now, I just want to know, there's been a long feedback period on the FAR overhaul, on some of the supplementary materials. Now, feedback is being directed to the idea scale, but this is not the notice and comment period yet. This is not the official regulatory notice and comment period. I wrote about that a few weeks ago on GovCon Intelligence, that when that notice and comment period starts, it's important for anybody who has an interest in the FAR overhaul to submit official comments at that time. And the reason is that by law, under Supreme Court precedent, agencies have to consider and respond to significant comments that are filed during the notice and comment period. The FAR does not have to respond to your feedback during the RFO period. It doesn't have to respond to your feedback at the idea scale site, but it does have to consider and respond to significant comments during the notice and comment period. That period has not started yet. Certainly, I'll come in line and tell people about that when it starts. Okay, I want to go through some questions that I've gotten on a few articles on LinkedIn, Substack. As always, feel free to leave comments on this post or reply to the post if you have questions. I get to all the questions either in real time or in these Q&A sessions. So one comment on an article that I posted a couple weeks ago was about the limitation on subcontracting. I said that the 40% rule for contracting, limitations on subcontracting and mentor-protege arrangements is tricky because most people don't realize that you can stack it on top of the limitation on subcontracting. You can get down to 20% prime work on a services contract. That sounds sketchy, according to the questioner, but it's technically legal if structured right. They ask, is SBA going to start scrutinizing these ventures way more closely now that they're doing this audit? That's right. I went through that more closely, in part based on this question in my last article about stacking the 40% and the 50%. If you multiply those two together, you get 20%. So you can, in a mentor-protege joint venture, go as low as 20% for the small business portion, you have to organize it correctly. You can't have the mentor doing more than 60% of the work of the joint venture, but you can get down to 20% if you do that correctly. Is SBA going to scrutinize these joint ventures? Interestingly, the letter, the 8A audit letter, just has one short mention of joint ventures. It's about the list of vendors and including joint ventures. So it doesn't seem to focus specifically at joint ventures. I would not be surprised, of course, for SBA to look closely at joint ventures because that does seem like an opportunity more so to reduce the amount of small business work. Now, there's an easy solution to this. SBA could just raise that 40% at some point, maybe get that to 50%. So the limit would be 25%, or maybe not allow that stacking. That would be a big change if they did that. But you can do regulatory changes so that you prevent that legal minimum performance of 20%. So that's legal right now. There'd be easy regulatory changes to address that. Okay. Another question is about what's the ultimate intent? It says federal small business prime and subcontractors should follow the legislation going through the small business committees. It appears the ultimate intent is to do away with set-aside programs. This will have a huge impact on the 25% small business contracting goal. So much for small business is the backbone of the economy, providing jobs, driving innovation, contributing significantly to the GDP. This is the mantra used by presidential candidates. The I went over some of the testimony that was in the Senate hearing last week, and there are two witnesses in particular that suggested exactly this, exactly doing away with the small business programs. One of the witnesses, the first witness from the Daily Wire, seemed to equate 8A sole source with set-asides and called for the elimination of all set-aside programs. I think that's wrong. I think you can you can limit sole source. It seems like that may be the direction the government is going based on these Ernst letters and the way that SBA has expressed how the program works in its press releases. So you can do away or limit sole source without really affecting the set-aside program. Set-asides are still competitive. And there's actually research showing that there's more competition on small business set-asides than there is even on full and open. And the theory there is if there's a small business set-aside, more small businesses are going to compete on that as compared to full and open because they know they potentially have a chance of winning, a realistic chance of winning. Because if they compete on full and open, they're competing against the big contractors. They really have no shot at winning. But on a set-aside, they're competing against light companies, so they have a better chance of winning. And so you get actually more competition on small business set-asides. So the idea is try to bring new entrants, have more competition. Set-asides are actually the way to do it as compared to just doing full and open. So I'm confused about why the witness would equate sole source with set-asides when set-asides are actually the way to maximize competition. I'll get to the second witness that brought something intriguing up in a moment. Uh, uh, Another comment that I got just pointing out that neither GAO nor the SBA Inspector General has ever done a comparative assessment of fraud rates among various small business groups. Compliance issues can be found in every program, and just having one high-profile prosecution plus some audits does not necessarily mean there's rampant fraud. So the point here is, yes, there may be some fraud in the 8A program. Certainly, I pointed out there's $22,000 worth of fraud at least, and there may be more that isn't described in that situation or in that DOJ press release. And, SBA may find some fraud through this audit, but there's fraud in the operation of contracting, not just in the government, but in private contracting. And there's going to be levels of fraud. The 8A program, I tried to make the point in my article, seems to actually have less fraud than there is outside. And I think people have even said to me that when contracting officers hear something's 8A, they expect to get some sort of discount on it. And maybe it's because of the sole source threshold or just the history of disadvantaged business contracting. There's been research as well from Ben Brunges and others showing that small disadvantaged business contracts, including 8A contracts, can come in at the same price or even less than other contracts over the course of the contract, looking at modifications during the course of the contract. So, yes, we've seen that there's thousands of dollars worth of fraud in the 8A program. How does that compare to other programs? How does that compare to some of the new direct award authorities that are out there, like CSOs and OTAs. I don't think we've seen those analyses yet. So zeroing in on the 8A program to the based on the level of fraud there, seems like it's jumping to a conclusion about the 8A program that doesn't have the data behind it. Okay, another question that I got on LinkedIn is, what is the standard and process for challenging or defending an applicant's claim of being socially disadvantaged? The questioner is suggesting that the statute and regulations are not helpful in coming up with that standard or process. I, I agree with that. I noted in my article that the disadvantage narrative process is weird. I don't really understand why SBA, which is the agency that's responsible for supporting small business, gets to determine whether an individual experienced discrimination. It doesn't seem like it's the core competency for SBA. And then this extra point about the process, there used to be a presumption of social disadvantage, and presumption, that word means that somebody could come and challenge that. You presume that something's true, but it can be reversed. There wasn't really a process for reversing that. And even now, with the narrative process, SBA clears a narrative, but what if somebody comes and says, oh, this narrative is not true, or this person really has had more advantages than a normal socially disadvantaged person? I don't know that there is a process for that. They can file with SBA. I think there's an address or an email in the FAR for challenging a company's small disadvantaged business status. But first of all, I don't know that it actually happens, and SBA doesn't have a full process for adjudicating those challenges, just because it really doesn't happen, uh, if at all. And another question or comment that, this fraud could have been more than or less than $22,000. It could have been $2,000. But the comment is, this is really about bringing down the SBA. They've seen waiting for the axe to fall. The plan seems to be for federal contracting to be the exclusive domain of large businesses, with barely table scraps left for small businesses. So here's my uh, opportunity to talk about the other witness, the witness from Open the Books, that suggested that SBA be eliminated entirely. So the quote was, the witness said, we should return business to business and business to the states. So maybe there'd be room for state level small business administrations, but not for a U.S. small business administration. I was really curious about how the committee would respond to the suggestion. They have oversight over the SBA. How would the committee respond to the suggestion that this agency should be eliminated entirely? And obviously, the committee probably wouldn't exist at that point, too. And the chair said he said, wow, and said that's a profound statement, the statement that you should return business to business. Look, SBA's been around for a long time, 1953, so we're 50 plus 20. Yeah, so we're 72 years into the history of SBA. It's responsible for providing loan assistance, providing government contracting, providing training. SBA is a big player in the federal small business states. It gives assistance to states through the form of grants and educational opportunities. So there is a role, I think, for a federal small business administration. The bigger question is, within these government contracting fields, should there be special assistance to certain areas and certain types of businesses? So we're talking about disadvantaged businesses, women-owned businesses, service-able veteran-owned businesses. This is really a political decision. I mean, these programs have been created by Congress based on the will of the people, and certainly the will of the people changes over time. So there may be room to fiddle with those programs. Some of those programs are fairly new. I was at the SBA when the veterans program started and went to certification, moved over to SBA. So there's room to change how these programs work. I think the objection here is the people have not spoken on the 8A program. The program is still in statute, it's still authorized, and the program's being whittled down and narrowed because of allegations of fraud. But as I stated in my last article, the fraud doesn't seem to be as widespread as SBA is saying. Okay, one last question. Do you think there will be many limitations on subcontracting violations uncovered? Uh, I'm, I'm sure there are violations out there. I don't know that the questions that SBA is asking will allow it to uncover those violations. There may be prima facie evidence based on the data that's submitted, but as I've mentioned, the LOS is nuanced. So you have to know, were some of those companies similarly situated? What was the status of the contract? Is it a mixed contract? Was this under a joint venture? How much profit did the company retain? What was the total amount dispersed on the contract? So if the SBA is not getting that information, I don't know that they'll be able to jump to a conclusion and say the LOS has been violated. They may do that anyway. They may say, in a lot of these cases, we saw initial evidence that the LOS has been violated. But when you actually look at the limitations of subcontracting, it's not created by SBA. That's created by Congress. The current LOS is a product of the NDAA of 2013. It's a congressional statute, and it has exceptions. It has nuances. And to really get to a violation, you have to look at all of these aspects. You have to look at the contract, you have to look at the subcontracts, the value of them, how the contract is organized. Is it mixed, or is it services or supplies? Non-manufactural is another issue that comes up with this. So just being able to look at 4,300 submissions and looking at this accounting data that's coming through is probably not enough to make a resolute decision about whether the limitation of subcontracting has been violated. All right, so for our last session of 2025, I'm going to go to the case law that's come out. My favorite part of this, honestly. I like doing the cases. Okay, so we've got a bunch of cases that have been issued since the last time I did a case law update. I'm going to start with GAO. I'm kind of go in reverse order. GAO came out with a COC case, which is exciting because you don't see many COC cases. This is one of the quiz questions they ask at SBA. Do you know what a COC is? COC stands for Certificate of Competency. And the question in this GAO case that came out was, did the Army need to refer a past performance evaluation to SBA under their Certificate of Competency procedure? So the COC is a process that says whenever an agency finds a small business to be non-responsible, the agency has to refer that question to SBA. That gives that small business an opportunity to appeal that non-responsibility determination. So SBA gets to chime in on whether that small business is responsible or not responsible. There are a lot of contract level questions that come up about COCs because SBA's rules say agencies still need to refer for a COC responsibility type determinations, even if they're not strictly responsibility determinations. So one example is a pass-fail acceptability and kind of past performance or corporate experience element. If it's a pass-fail, that acts like a responsibility determination. And if an agency says a company failed that determination, the agency has to refer that to SBA. Here, in this case with the Army, the GAO said the Army did not have to refer it to the COC because COC is only there for, so quote unquote, binary choices. So that's pass, fail, go, no go. Here, the Army's evaluation was, there were maybe 4 options. One of them was satisfactory confidence. That's what this company, C-Slope, got. And then there was substantial confidence above that. But I think there were 2 more below satisfactory confidence. And because it was not go, no go or pass, fail, GAO said, not a binary choice. That means you do not have to refer it to the COC. The Army can go ahead with its evaluation of this company, and the protester had its protest dismissed by the GAO. I have a COFC case as well, Court of Federal Claims case that involved the SBA's once 8A, always 8A rule. This was the protest of Vinsys IT Hub. And this was interesting because it dealt with a regulatory change the SBA made fairly recently. I thought it was more recent than it was, but it was actually back to 2020. It used to be that an agency, when it made a new requirement determination, just had to notify SBA. Let me talk a bit about what a new requirement is. There's a once 8A, always 8A rule. That rule has come up during the FAR overhaul. But the once 8A, always 8A rule says that if a requirement is in the 8A program, its follow-on has to stay in the 8A program unless SBA releases it. So that agency has to come to SBA and get an affirmative release in order to procure that outside of the 8A program. Now, that rule has changed under the FAR overhaul, but I'm not going to be talking about that. I don't want to get to this COCs case. The once 8A, always 8A rule has an exception. It says if that the once 8A, always 8A rule does not apply to new requirements. And the reason is it applies to follow-ons, and a new requirement's not a follow-on. There was a problem back in when SBA created this rule that agencies were using that new requirement exception to a wider extent than SBA thought. And SBA thought there's too many agencies trying to abuse this new requirement exception. So rather than just notifying SBA, well, first it was you have to notify SBA that something's a new requirement. And then in 2020, SBA changed the rule so that the agency must coordinate with SBA. That is not a super clear term, what it means to coordinate. So what does it mean to coordinate? I don't know that it's actually come up in case law until this case. This case dealt with that word coordinate. And what does it mean to coordinate a new requirement determination with SBA? Here, the agency was NIH, National Libraries, I think, of Health. And the NIH found that a follow-on type contract was a new requirement. Part of the reason was it had a 77% price increase from the prior contract. Price increase is one of the elements of finding out whether something's a new requirement. And also, this is a tech contract. The previous competition was in 2019. There's a lot of tech stuff that did not exist in 2019 that does now. And lo and behold, in this solicitation, there were AI-related tasks in the new contract, or some people think the follow-on contract, that were not in 2019. And NIH said these AI-related tasks also make it a new requirement. So the protester said that, oh, this isn't well coordinated. Also, there's not a new requirement. But in this case, Judge Ryan Holte, said the SBA and NIH sufficiently coordinated. NIH sent the determination to SBA. SBA sent back an email stating this is a new contract, release is not required. And additionally, because of this price increase and the new AI task, the judge said that was enough to show that this was a new requirement. The judge stated that the agency's back and forth was sufficient coordination under SBA's rules. This is Vinsys IT Hub LLC, and this is a case about the coordinate rule in SBA's once 8A, always 8A rule. I want to also go over an OHA case about veteran ownership. This was involving a service-able veteran-owned firm that underwent an ownership change, and it was a multi-step transaction. I think one of the owners, the veteran owner, sold his shares back to the company, and then the shares were then sold to another serviceable veteran. But there's a gap in between that documentation because of the second owner's delay in signing the ownership documents. The protester, Crosstown Courier Services, argued that the serviceable vet company, Caduceus, was ineligible because of this gap. There was a 12-day gap between the two steps of the transaction. And the protester cited an SBA rule that says the veteran has to own the business after the change. So what's the change there? Is the change after the first transaction where the serviceable veteran sold the shares back to the company, or is it after the second transaction? And the SBA found that that gap did not result in the company losing its serviceable veteran-owned status because the firm remained eligible after the transaction and was qualified at the time of offer. The serviceable vet-owned firm, Caduceus, could win award. The judge, Christopher Holloman, wrote that ruling otherwise would cause unintended consequences. In other words, companies should not forfeit their status because of a multi-step transaction. That would be contrary to the intent of SBA's rules. There was also an interesting criminal case decision that came out of the Middle District of Pennsylvania earlier this month. This was an interesting argument by the indicted party. There was a alleged conspiracy between individuals to defraud the 8A program for $80 million. And I'm thinking 8A audit now. They never point to this case when they're talking about the 8A audit. Anyway, so there's alleged fraud of $80 million in 8A contracts, and the alleged conspirators argued that the indictment should be thrown out as unconstitutional because the 8A program has potential unconstitutionality. So remember back to the Supreme Court affirmative action cases about college admissions, and then the Ultima Services case that applied that Supreme Court case to the 8A program. The Ultima Services case said that SBA's presumption of social disadvantage is unconstitutional under the Supreme Court's new precedent on racial preferences. That's been applied to DOT. We've been talking about social disadvantage and narratives and all that, but the reason for that is unconstitutionality of presumptions. So the criminal defendants in this case said, if the 8A program's unconstitutional, then you can't prosecute us because that would be unconstitutional as well. The judge did not accept that argument. The judge said that even if the eligibility rules for the 8A program are unconstitutional, the defendants cannot avoid prosecution for fraudulently violating the 8A rule. So you can't use the unconstitutionality of the entry process in the 8A program to say that your indictment itself is unconstitutional. Let's see. Do I have any other cases? Just a couple more cases to go over. One about SBIR and one about 8A eligibility. SBIR Phase III, that's a new authority under the FAR Overhaul. It's actually existed in statute for a while. There was a major case back about a year ago about SBIR Phase III, allowing agencies to go ahead with Phase III in wider circumstances, and that got followed up by this Bode Cellmark forensics case, Bode technology case that came out from GAO. That case says that ICE used SBIR Phase III properly to contract for a rapid DNA testing program. The standard in Phase III is whether the Phase III contract derives, extends from, or completes a prior SBIR effort. And GAO here said it did, and also GAO dismissed or disagreed with an argument that just because the contract had commercially available requirements, it couldn't be a Phase III contract. GAO ruled that there's nothing in the SBIR program that establishes a price test. In other words, you don't need a certain proportion of the contract coming from SBIR research in order for it to qualify for a Phase III award. Phase III is a sole source authority for companies that are in the SBIR program. And I'll close it out with a GAO case about 8A eligibility. So this was an interesting one. The building people. This is where it was using the GSA MAS 8A pool. I remember this was a big deal when I was at SBA a few years ago. GSA and SBA collaborated to create a separate pool on the federal supply schedule for 8A companies, and those companies could get sole source FSS orders, or they get competitive FSS orders, but it was a separate group for 8A companies, separate tranche just for 8A companies. And you don't always have to go to SBA for an offer and acceptance of under the 8A pool. It kind of depends on whether it's sole source or competitive. But in this instance, Department of Energy sought an eligibility determination from SBA for an award off of that 8A pool, and SBA came back and said, no, the firm is not eligible. I don't know if it graduated or what the circumstances were. And the question was, let's say under the requirements of the 8A pool that Energy was not required to go to SBA for an eligibility determination. I think that's the case most of the time in competitive orders off of the 8A pool, but Energy did do it anyway. Then what happens if SBA comes back and says you're not eligible? And then Department of Energy, in this case, disallowed that business from getting the contract. Here, GA ruled that although the regulations might not have required a eligibility determination from SBA, nothing prohibited the Department of Energy from getting one. So the fact that Department of Energy went to SBA and got it, even if it's not required by the regulation, does not mean that Energy can't later deny the award to a company that's found ineligible. GAO stated that it declines to consider arguments that would be more properly addressed to an appeal to SBA. So, the company wants to go to SBA and try to appeal its ineligibility determination, go right ahead, but that's not going to go to GAO. Thanks very much to everybody for watching. Thanks for an incredible 2025 for GovCon Intelligence. Our first year in operation, we got up to 1,600 subscribers, got a lot of feedback, and building a community around this new world of small business government contracting. Please keep the comments coming. Reply to this email, put comments in the comment box, or reply to me directly. Have a great end of the year. Happy holidays, everybody. See you in 2026.